The morning air over the Meuse River carried the scent of damp earth and diesel fumes, an odd mixture that would soon become familiar to every man defending the Belgian fortress that May morning in 1940. Lieutenant Georges Truffaut stood on the rampart of Fort Ében-Émael, watching the eastern horizon blur with the gray light of dawn, and wondered if the engineers who built these walls 3 centuries ago could have imagined their stonework would one day face something as monstrous as a German Panzer division. The fortress had stood since the age of muskets and cannons, its thick walls designed to absorb the impact of iron balls fired from primitive artillery, and now it was supposed to hold against the most advanced mechanized army the world had ever seen. Truffaut didn't feel confident. He felt like a man standing in a museum, waiting for the future to arrive and destroy everything around him. The radios had been crackling with warnings for hours. German armor was moving through the Ardennes forest, a place everyone said tanks couldn't possibly traverse. And now those same tanks were pushing toward the river crossings that separated occupied territory from the heartland of France. The generals had dismissed the possibility. The politicians had assured the public that the Maginot Beaumont would hold, but Truffaut had spent enough time in uniform to know that certainty was the first casualty of war. And now he stood on this ancient fortress, watching the sky lighten and feeling the weight of obsolescence settle over everything he was supposed to defend. His commanding officer had given him a single order that morning, an order so strange that Truffaut had asked him to repeat it twice just to be certain he'd heard correctly. The order was simple and absurd in equal measure. Prepare the moat. Most people didn't realize that Fort Ében-Émael still had a functioning moat. It wasn't the kind of thing modern armies advertised. The fortification had been upgraded over the decades, fitted with machine gun nests and anti-aircraft positions, reinforced with concrete and steel, but beneath all that modernization the old bones remained. The moat circled the outer walls like a medieval ghost, a channel carved into the earth that hadn't been filled with water in nearly 200 years. It was overgrown with weeds, littered with debris, and utterly forgotten by everyone except the engineering corps who maintained the old schematics in dusty filing cabinets. Truffaut's commanding officer, a gray-haired colonel named Beaumont, who had fought in the trenches of the Great War, had pulled those schematics from storage 3 days earlier and studied them by candlelight in his quarters. So, when Truffaut asked why, Beaumont had simply smiled and said that sometimes the old ways were the only ways that still made sense. The plan was medieval simplicity. The fortress sat on elevated ground overlooking a network of approach, roads and bridge crossings that the Germans would need to secure if they wanted to push their armor deeper into Belgium. Those roads were narrow, hemmed in by steep embankments and drainage ditches, and the bridges themselves were old stone structures that could barely support the weight of a loaded hay wagon, let alone a 30-ton Panzer. If the defenders could slow the German advance even by a few hours, it might give the Allied forces time to regroup and establish a proper defensive line further west. But slowing a mechanized column required more than small arms fire and wishful thinking. It required terrain. It required obstacles. It required turning the landscape itself into a weapon, and that was where the moat came in. Beaumont had ordered the engineering crews to open the floodgates of a nearby reservoir, a structure built in the 18th century to control the water flow for agricultural purposes, and redirect that water into the ancient moat system. Tracer rounds streaked across the moat like angry hornets, kicking up sprays of water and ricocheting off tank armor with metallic pings that sounded almost musical. The German infantry scattered, diving for cover behind their vehicles, and the engineers abandoned their pontoon equipment and retreated to safer position. The tanks returned fire, their main guns booming as they lobbed high-explosive shells at the fortress walls, but the old stone absorbed the impacts with stubborn resilience. Truffaut realized that Beaumont had been right. The fortress wasn't a relic. It was a tool, and in the right hands it could still bite. The Germans tried 3 more times to establish a crossing, and each time the defenders drove them back. The moat was too wide and too deep for infantry to wade across, and the bridges were either collapsed or under heavy fire. The tanks couldn't advance without crossing points, and the crossing points couldn't be secured without infantry support. It was a stalemate, the kind of grinding positional warfare that hadn't been seen since the trenches of the Great War. And it was happening because a medieval moat had been filled with water. The German commanders grew frustrated. They called in artillery support, and soon shells were raining down on the fortress in a steady barrage that turned the afternoon into a thunderstorm of smoke and noise. But the walls held. The defenders stayed in their positions, and the moat remained an uncrossable barrier. Hours passed. The sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the battlefield in shades of orange and gold that seemed grotesquely beautiful given the violence unfolding below. Truffaut moved between firing positions, checking on his men, redistributing ammunition, and trying not to think about how long they could hold. The machine gun barrels were overheating, the ammunition stocks were dwindling, and the Germans showed no signs of giving up. They were probing the flanks now, sending reconnaissance units to search for undefended approaches, and Truffaut knew it was only a matter of time before they found a weakness. Then something unexpected happened. A radio message came through from Allied headquarters, crackling with static but clear enough to understand. Reinforcements were on their way. A French armored division had been rerouted from its original position and was now moving to intercept the German column. The estimated time of arrival was 2 hours. 2 hours. That was all the defenders needed to hold. 2 hours stood between success and failure, between a tactical victory and a meaningless sacrifice. Beaumont gathered his officers and told them the news, and Truffaut saw something change in their faces. They'd been fighting without hope, going through the motions of resistance because it was their duty, but now they had something to fight for. They had a deadline. They had a goal. They had a reason to believe that their suffering might actually matter. The Germans launched their final assault just before sunset. They brought up flamethrower teams and started clearing the defensive positions one by one, forcing the machine gunners to retreat deeper into the fortress. They positioned tanks on the high ground and began firing directly into the embrasures, trying to silence the remaining guns through sheer volume of fire. They sent combat engineers forward with explosive charges to blow gaps in the moat walls and drain the water. It was a coordinated professional assault, the kind of operation that had swept aside every other defensive line the Wehrmacht had encountered, and for a while it looked like it might succeed. Truffaut watched from the command post as section after section fell silent, the radio reports growing more desperate with each passing minute. The line was collapsing, the fortress was failing, the ancient walls were finally meeting their match, but the moat held just long enough. The French armor arrived exactly on schedule, their tanks rumbling down the western approach roads with a sound that made Truffaut want to weep with relief. The German column, caught between the fortress and the arriving reinforcement, suddenly found itself in an impossible position. They'd committed their entire force to breaching the moat, leaving themselves vulnerable to a counterattack from the rear, and now that counterattack was here. The German commanders made the only sensible decision. They withdrew. They pulled their tanks back, gathered their infantry, and retreated eastward to regroup and find another route. The fortress had held. The moat had worked. A 500-year-old defensive tactic had stopped a modern panzer division, at least for a day. Truffaut walked along the ramparts after the fighting stopped, looking down at the water-filled moat and the wreckage scattered along its banks. The collapsed bridge was still there, the submerged tank jutting from the water like a monument to hubris. Burn marks scarred the ancient stones. Shell craters dotted the courtyard, but the walls stood. The fortress survived, and somewhere to the west, Allied commanders were redrawing their maps, buying time with the hours that Beaumont and his men had earned. The story of Fort Ében-Émael and its medieval moat didn't make headline. It was buried in after-action reports and classified documents, overshadowed by larger battles and more dramatic defeats. The French armored division that arrived to relieve the fortress was itself destroyed 2 weeks later in the general collapse of the Allied front. Belgium fell. France fell. The war continued for 5 more years, and by the time it ended, the fortress and its moat were footnotes in a much larger narrative. But for the men who fought there, for Truffaut and Beaumont and the machine gunners who held their positions until their ammunition ran out, the battle meant everything. It meant that ingenuity could trump technology. It meant that history wasn't a straight line from primitive to advanced, from obsolete to modern. It meant that sometimes the old ways worked precisely because no one expected them anymore. Beaumont wrote a single line in his official report about the engagement, a line that would be discovered decades later by historians researching the fall of Belgium. He wrote, "The fortress performed as designed, and the enemy was delayed by the method of our ancestors." It was a dry, bureaucratic sentence that completely failed to capture the chaos and terror of the battle, but it contained a truth that Truffaut would carry with him for the rest of his life, the method of our ancestors. So, those 4 words acknowledge something that modern warfare often forgot, that terrain and time were weapons just as potent as steel and gunpowder, and that a commander who understood history could sometimes find solutions that no amount of modern training would reveal. The German army learned its own lessons from the encounter. In subsequent operations, Wehrmacht engineers carried specialized bridging equipment designed to span wider gaps, and reconnaissance units were given explicit orders to identify and report any historical fortifications that might still be defensible. The High Command issued a directive warning field commanders not to underestimate outdated structures, noting that walls built to withstand cannon fire often held up surprisingly well against modern artillery. It was an implicit admission that the old fortress had done something unexpected, something worth studying even in defeat. The tanks had been stopped, if only temporarily, by a tactic that predated the internal combustion engine by 5 centuries. Truffaut survived the war. He was captured during the collapse of France and spent 4 years in a German prisoner of war camp, where he passed the time drawing maps from memory and teaching younger prisoners about military history. He told them about Fort Ében-Émael. He described how Beaumont had studied those old schematics by candlelight, how the engineering crews had worked through the night to clear the moat channels, how the water had risen just in time to turn the landscape into an impassable barrier. Some of the younger men didn't believe him. They thought he was exaggerating or inventing stories to boost morale. But the ones who'd fought in Belgium, the ones who'd seen what desperation and creativity could accomplish, they understood. They knew that war wasn't just about who had the better weapons or the larger army. It was about who could adapt faster, who could think more clearly under pressure, and who could recognize opportunity even in the ruins of the past. After the liberation, Truffaut returned to Fort Ében-Émael. The fortress was abandoned by then, its military value exhausted, and nature was already beginning to reclaim the stonework. Vines grew up the walls, weeds filled the courtyard, and the moat, no longer maintained, had drained itself and returned to the overgrown channel it had been before Beaumont's orders brought it back to life. Truffaut stood on the rampart where he'd watched the German tanks approach, and he tried to reconcile his memories with the quiet ruin around him. It was hard to believe that this place had been important, that men had died here fighting over stones and water, but importance was always temporary. The fortress had mattered for 1 day, maybe 2, and then the war had moved on and left it behind. He found Beaumont's grave in a military cemetery outside Brussels. The old colonel had been killed during the retreat, caught by a German artillery barrage while trying to evacuate wounded men from a field hospital. There was no elaborate monument, just a simple white cross with his name and rank carved into the stone. Truffaut stood there for a long time, thinking about the man who'd ordered the moat filled and wondering if Beaumont had known, in those final moments, that his strategy had worked. The fortress had held. The tanks had been stopped. The Allied forces had gained the time they needed, even if that time had ultimately proved insufficient. It was a small victory in a war full of defeats, but victories were still victories, no matter how small. The broader significance of what happened at Fort Ében-Émael only became clear years later, when military historians began analyzing the German invasion of Western Europe and trying to understand why it had succeeded so quickly. The consensus was that the Allies had failed to adapt to modern warfare, that they'd been too committed to outdated strategies and defensive thinking, but Truffaut always believed that analysis missed something crucial. The problem wasn't that the Allies were too committed to the past. The problem was that they weren't committed enough. Beaumont had understood that history was a resource, that the tactics and technologies of previous centuries could still be valuable if applied correctly. Most of his fellow officers had dismissed the fortress as a relic, something to be abandoned or ignored. But Beaumont had seen it for what it really was, a tool waiting to be used. The moat tactic worked because it exploited a vulnerability in German operational planning. The Wehrmacht relied on speed and momentum, on the ability to keep moving forward before defenders could organize effective resistance. That strategy required infrastructure, roads, bridges, crossings. When those critical pieces of infrastructure were denied or destroyed, the entire advance ground to a halt. The Germans could eventually overcome any obstacle given enough time and resources, but time was exactly what they didn't want to give their enemies. Every hour of delay was an hour for reinforcements to arrive, for defensive lines to be established, for plans to be revised. The moat at Fort Ében-Émael didn't stop the German army. It just slowed them down. But in war, especially in those first chaotic weeks of the campaign, even a few hours could change everything. What made Beaumont's decision so remarkable was its simplicity. He didn't try to out-technology the German. He didn't call for experimental weapons or revolutionary tactics. He just looked at what he had available, studied the old fortress plans, and realized that the medieval engineers who built the moat had already solved the problem he was facing. They'd understood that attacking forces needed to cross obstacles and that water-filled moats were surprisingly effective at preventing crossing. The technology didn't matter. The principles remained the same. A tank might be more advanced than a mounted knight, but both needed solid ground to operate, and both would be stopped by deep water and mud. There was something almost poetic about the way the battle played out. The fortress had been built to resist siege warfare, the slow, grinding campaigns where armies would surround a strongpoint and try to starve it into submission. For centuries, that's exactly what it had done, its walls absorbing cannon fire while defenders waited for relief forces to arrive. Then warfare changed. Sieges became obsolete. Armies learned to bypass strongpoints and strike at supply lines instead. The fortress lost its purpose and faded into irrelevance. But when the German Panzers came rolling through Belgium in 1940, the old siege logic suddenly made sense again. Stay again. The fortress didn't need to hold forever. It just needed to hold long enough for relief to arrive. And relief came just as it had during countless medieval sieges, when friendly forces counterattacked and drove the enemy away. Truffaut often wondered what would have happened if more commanders had thought like Beaumont. What if the entire Maginot Line had been designed with similar principles, combining modern firepower with ancient defensive concepts? What if the French and Belgian armies had systematically demolished bridges and flooded valleys, turning the landscape into an obstacle course that would have forced the German advance to slow to a crawl? It was impossible to know if such tactics would have changed the outcome of the war, but they might have bought enough time for mobilization, for evacuation, for the diplomatic maneuvering that could have altered the strategic picture. Instead, the Allies bet everything on static defenses and outdated plans, and when those failed, the collapse was catastrophic. The men who fought at Fort Ében-Émael never received much recognition for their effort. There were no medals, no parades, no monuments erected in their honor. They were simply absorbed into the larger story of defeat and occupation, their individual sacrifice lost in the broader narrative. But Truffaut believed that obscurity didn't diminish their achievement. They'd been given an impossible task to hold a medieval fortress against modern armor, and they'd succeeded longer than anyone had a right to expect. They'd used ingenuity and determination to make up for the vast technological superiority. They'd proven that warfare wasn't just about equipment and firepower, that human creativity and historical knowledge still mattered even in the age of mechanized warfare. As Truffaut grew older, he became something of an amateur historian himself, collecting accounts of unusual defensive actions and studying the ways that outnumbered or outgunned forces had managed to resist superior enemies. He was particularly interested in cases where ancient tactics or obsolete weapons had proven unexpectedly effective, and he assembled a collection of such stories that eventually filled several notebooks. There was the account of Soviet defenders in Stalingrad who used rubble and ruins to negate German advantages in armor and air support, turning the city into a medieval-style maze where combat devolved to close-quarters fighting. There was the story of Finnish soldiers who used skis and Molotov cocktails ambush Soviet tank columns during the Winter War, employing tactics that wouldn't have been out of place in the Napoleonic era. There was the tale of British commandos who captured a German radar station in Norway using climbing techniques borrowed from mountaineering expeditions that predated modern warfare by decades. Each of these stories reinforced the lesson that Truffaut had learned at Fort Ében-Émael. That military history wasn't a linear progression from primitive to advanced, but rather a cycle where old solutions often regained relevance when circumstances. The tank had made cavalry obsolete, but partisan warfare brought back many of the same tactics that light cavalry had once employed. Strategic bombing was supposed to make ground combat unnecessary, but wars were still decided by infantry occupying territory. Nuclear weapons promised to make conventional armies irrelevant, but most conflicts continued to be fought with rifles and grenades. The tools changed, but the fundamental problems remained constant, and commanders who understood that constancy could often find answers in unexpected places. Truffaut wrote a short memoir in the 1970s, mostly for his grandchildren, describing his experiences during the war. He devoted several pages to the battle at Fort Ében-Émael, and he tried to explain why that particular engagement had meant so much to him. It wasn't the military significance, which was minimal in the grand scheme of the war. It wasn't the number of enemy casualties, which was negligible. It was the principle behind Beaumont's decision to fill the moat, the recognition that wisdom didn't have an expiration and that solutions didn't become invalid just because they were old. Truffaut believed that modern society had lost sight of that principle, that there was a dangerous tendency to dismiss anything from the past as outdated or irrelevant, and he worried that future generations would pay the price for that arrogance. The memoir was never published. Truffaut's children found it after his death in 1982 and considered submitting it to various publishing houses, but they were told that World War II memoirs were no longer fashionable unless they contained dramatic revelations or celebrity connections. A small historical society in Belgium eventually acquired the manuscript and filed it in their archives, where it sat unread for decades. It wasn't until the 2010s, when military historians began using digital tools to search through old documents, that someone stumbled across Truffaut's account and realized its significance. By then, Fort Ében-Émael had become a tourist attraction, its walls restored and its history sanitized for educational displays, and the story of the moat had been reduced to a single plaque mentioning that defensive measures were employed during the German invasion. But the principle that Beaumont had demonstrated remained relevant. Military academies began teaching the Fort Ében-Émael engagement as a case study in asymmetric defense, examining how creative use of terrain could offset technological disadvantages. Both urban warfare specialists noted the similarities between the fortress defense and modern combat in cities, where buildings and rubble could channel attacking forces into kill zones just as effectively as medieval walls. Even civilian disaster planners found lessons in the story, recognizing that old infrastructure properly understood and adapted could sometimes provide emergency solutions that new construction couldn't match. The moat might have been 500 years old, but its utility was timeless. What Truffaut could never have known, sitting on that rampart in 1940, watching the water fill the moat channels, was that his experience would eventually influence military thinking far beyond that single battle. Doctrine writers would reference Fort Ében-Émael when arguing for the importance of terrain analysis and historical knowledge in officer training. Engineering manuals would include sections on identifying and utilizing historical fortifications for defensive purposes. And countless staff college students would write papers analyzing what went right and what went wrong during those few hours when medieval defenses held off modern armor. The battle had seemed insignificant at the time, a minor delaying action in a campaign that was already lost, but its intellectual legacy would extend far beyond its tactical. The German tankers who participated in the assault rarely spoke about it after. For them, Fort Ében-Émael represented an embarrassment, a place where their supposedly invincible panzers had been stopped by stone walls and muddy water. Some of them carried grudges for years, convinced that their commanders had failed them by not properly reconnoitering the approaches or bringing adequate bridging equipment. Others treated it as a learning experience, a reminder that overconfidence was dangerous and that every objective required thorough planning, regardless of how weak the enemy appeared. A few recognized that they'd encountered something unusual that day, that the defenders had done something clever that deserved respect even in defeat. But mostly, the battle was forgotten, buried under the weight of larger engagements and more significant victories. For the tank that ended up submerged in the moat, the story had an unexpected epilogue. After the war, when Europe was rebuilding and every piece of scrap metal was valuable, someone organized a salvage operation to recover the vehicle. It took 3 days of pumping and hauling to extract it from the mud, and when they finally dragged it onto dry land, they found that it was remarkably well preserved. The water had protected it from corrosion, and aside from some cosmetic damage and a seized engine, the tank was largely intact. It was eventually donated to a military museum in Brussels, where it was restored and put on display with a placard explaining that it had been knocked out during the Battle of Belgium. The placard didn't mention the moat. It didn't explain how a medieval defensive feature had caused the tank's demise. It simply noted that the vehicle had been lost in action, and visitors walked past it without understanding the irony of its fate. Beaumont's decision to flood the moat was never officially recognized by military authorities. There was no formal commendation, no strategic analysis praising his initiative, no inclusion in official histories of the campaign. The reason was simple. The battle didn't fit the narrative that Allied commanders wanted to tell about the fall of France. That narrative emphasized German superiority and Allied unpreparedness, and it left little room for stories about creative defensive successes or tactical innovations that worked exactly as intended. Acknowledging that a medieval moat had stopped 40 tanks would have raised uncomfortable questions about why more such measures hadn't been implemented, about why the defensive planning had been so inadequate, about whether the collapse could have been prevented if more officers had thought outside the conventional frameworks. It was easier to leave the story buried in classified reports and forgotten memoirs, but Truffaut never forgot, and neither did the other men who fought there. They carried the memory with them through prisoner of war camps in occupation and liberation, and after the war they would occasionally gather at reunions and talk about the day they'd held off the Panzers with water and stones. They'd laugh about how absurd it had been, how desperate and improvised, and then they'd grow quiet and remember the friends who hadn't survived. The moat had bought them time, but time hadn't been enough. The fortress had fallen eventually. The war had been lost. But for a few hours on a spring day in 1940, they'd done something remarkable. They'd proven that courage and ingenuity could still matter even when the odds were impossible. They'd shown that the past wasn't dead, that history could reach forward and touch the present in unexpected ways. And they'd learned that sometimes the oldest tactics were the best tactic, not because they were sophisticated or advanced, but because they addressed fundamental realities of combat that no amount of technological progress could eliminate. When military historians today discuss the Battle of France, Fort Ében-Émael rarely gets more than a passing mention. The focus is on larger failures on the Maginot Line and the Ardennes breakthrough and the failure of Allied coordination. But for those who understand what happened at that medieval fortress, for those who appreciate the elegance of Beaumont's solution and the determination of the men who implemented it, the story carries a significance that transcends its modest tactical impact. It's a reminder that warfare is fundamentally about problem-solving under pressure, about finding ways to accomplish objectives despite limited resources and overwhelming opposition. The fact that Beaumont solved his problem by reaching back 5 centuries for inspiration doesn't make his solution any less valid. If anything, it makes it more impressive because it demonstrates a kind of intellectual flexibility that many modern commanders lack. The moat at Fort Ében-Émael was drained again after the German occupation. The Wehrmacht had no use for medieval defenses, and they converted the fortress into a supply depot and administrative center. The water channels were filled in with rubble, the walls were reinforced with concrete, and all traces of the improvised defensive measures were systematically removed. By the time Allied forces liberated Belgium in 1944, the fortress looked nothing like it had during those desperate hours in 1940. The history had been literally buried, and it would take decades of archaeological work and documentary research to uncover what had actually happened there. But you can still see traces if you know where to look. The collapsed bridge was never properly repaired, and the gap in the stonework remains visible to anyone who walks the perimeter. The machine gun positions that Truffaut's men occupied are still there, their firing slits looking out over the approaches where German tanks once massed. And if you visit on a rainy day, when water collects in the old moat channels, you can imagine what it must have looked like when the floodgates opened and the ancient defenses came back to life. You can picture the German commanders standing in their tank turrets, watching in frustration as their advance ground to a halt. You can hear the rattle of machine guns and the boom of artillery. You can sense the desperation and determination of men fighting with everything they had, using every advantage they could find, refusing to surrender even when surrender seemed inevitable. That's the real lesson of Fort Ében-Émael, the truth that Beaumont understood and Truffaut carried with him for the rest of his life. War isn't just about weapons and tactics, it's about will and imagination. It's about refusing to accept that defeat is inevitable just because the enemy has superior force. It's about looking at the resources available, no matter how unconventional or outdated they might seem, and finding ways to make them work. The moat was 500 years old, designed for a different era and a different kind of warfare, but it still worked because the fundamental principle remained valid. You can't advance if you can't cross the barrier. That principle was true in the age of pikemen and arquebuses, and it was still true in the age of panzers and dive bombers. Technology changes constantly, But human ingenuity and the laws of physics remain remarkably constant, and commanders who understand that constancy will always have an advantage over those who assume that progress has made all old knowledge obsolete. The 40 tanks that were stopped at Fort Ében-Émael eventually found another route and continued their advance into France. The war continued. History moved forward. But for one day in one place, the past reached out and grabbed the future by the throat and refused to let go. A medieval moat, filled with water by desperate men following orders from a colonel who'd studied dusty schematics by candlelight, stopped the most modern army in the world. They laughed at Beaumont's ancient tactic right up until the moment their lead tank plunged into 6 feet of muddy water and their entire offensive ground to a halt. And in that moment, surrounded by walls that had stood for centuries and defended by soldiers who refused to give up, the old fortress proved that obsolescence was always a matter of context, and that sometimes the best way forward was to remember what had worked in the past. The moat held. The fortress stood, and for a few precious hours, history showed that it still had lessons to teach anyone willing to listen.